Now we've really done it. We're finished with Reconstruction. Hooray! But we want to go through it one more time in a detailed example to show how all the different stages fit together. And which example are we going to pick? Well, if you've been in the course this far, I bet you can guess. Robert Redford again. We're going to look at paragraph 3 of his article and go through Reconstruction to show that Reconstruction gives you an even deeper understanding than when we first went through it using close analysis alone. Reconstruction begins with close analysis, so the first thing I'll do is read through the passage and mark the important words in order to do a close analysis of Redford's paragraph. The BLM says its hands are tied. Remember, the BLM is the Bureau of Land Management. Why? Because is a premise marker. It's indicating that the sentence after it is a premise for the conclusion that the BLM's hands are tied. Because these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. You could say that valid and rights are evaluative terms, but that's not going to matter to our analysis here. And Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Now notice we've got a tricky argument marker here, gives it, because the point of that sentence is that it's the lease that explains why it has the right to drill or justifies the claim that it does have the right to drill. So gives it is an argument marker, and in particular, it has the right to drill as the conclusion, so it's a conclusion marker. Sure, Conoco has a lease. Sure is going to be an assuring term. More than one, in fact. In fact is another assuring term. But is going to be a discounting term, indicating that there's an objection being responded to. Those leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. Now you could think that originally is a guarding term because it's not saying that there never was sufficient environmental input, that is, environmental study or public input. It might have come later, just not originally, but again, that's not going to play any part in the argument itself. So it could be a guarding term, but you can mark it if you want. But as a result, the first 3 words of the next sentence, that's clearly an argument marker, and it's indicating that the sentence after it is a conclusion, so it's a conclusion marker. None of them conveyed a valid right to drill. What's more, now we're indicating there's a separate argument, there's a new premise coming, another reason for the same conclusion. In deciding to issue a permit to drill right now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling in these incomparable lands, but discounting, right? Instead determined that there would be no significant environmental harm on the basis of, this is telling you how they reached that determination, it was an abbreviated review. They had an abbreviated review that justified or explained their determination, so that's a premise marker. It didn't even look, even is a tricky one, it's discounting an objection. It's saying, well, they looked a little bit, but they didn't look at this. Discounting the objection that they did look at least some. They didn't even look at drilling on the other federal leases. Okay? Sounds like, clearly a guarding term, it's not saying it is, but it sounds like Washington doublespeak. Doublespeak is bad. You don't want to doublespeak. To me, and maybe to me is another guarding term in the sense that it sounds that way to me but not to others. So we could mark that as a guard as well. So we have finished stage 1 of reconstructing this argument. We've done a close analysis. The next stage is to get rid of all the excess verbiage. So we'll start a new screen and do that. The BLM says its hands are tied. Well, the claim is that its hands are tied, so we can get rid of the fact that the BLM says that. Why? Because we can get rid of those words because they're going to get replaced by a dot pyramid in standard form. These lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. Good. And Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Good. And we can get rid of, because we're going to have two separate premises there. That gives it, right? Well, that's going to be an argument marker, as we saw. That's going to get replaced by another dot pyramid. Sure, Conoco has a lease. More than one, in fact. Now notice there, Redford is admitting what his opponent claims, but that's not going to be part of his argument. He's just saying, I recognize that. His arguments can be based on different claims, so we can get rid of, sure, Conoco has a lease, more than one in fact, and the but tells you that he's just answering an objection. These leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or input. That's going to be an important premise. As a result, we saw that was an argument marker, going to be replaced by a dot pyramid like the others. None of them conveyed a valid right to drill. What's more, another argument marker, so it's going to get replaced by a dot pyramid. In deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis, blah, 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 but instead, that's going to be discounting terms, and that's going to be important for understanding what the sentences are doing, but it's not going to get repeated in the premise when we put it in standard form. They determined there would be no significant impact on the basis of an abbreviated review that didn't even look at drilling on the other federal leases. The next step is to take all the parts that weren't crossed out, they're going to be the explicit premises and conclusion in the argument, and put them into standard form. And if you think about this paragraph, there are really two arguments, because at the start, what Redford tries to do is to state what the BLM's argument was to begin with, and then he gives his own argument against what the BLM says. So the BLM's argument can be put in standard form like this. First premise, Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. Second premise, these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. And those two premises lead to the conclusion that the BLM's hands are tied. Now that's the BLM's argument that Redford is arguing against. Redford's own argument on the other side starts with the premise, those leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. Second premise, in deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands, but instead determined there would be no significant environmental harm on the basis of an abbreviated review that didn't even look at drilling on other federal leases. Those two premises lead to the conclusion that none of these conveyed a valid right to drill. And then there's another premise, these lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights, and that's supposed to lead the conclusion this is Washington doublespeak. Well, we'll have to see what all that means when we clarify, but that's basically the standard form. It might be a good idea to double check, because you want to make sure that every sentence you didn't cross out is somewhere there in the standard form. So let's look back at the passage where we crossed out the excess and make sure everything's there in the standard form. Okay, it's all there. Good. Well, the next stage is to sharpen edges, and that means clarify the premises and break them up, where doing so would help understand what they're really claiming. So let's look first at the BLM's argument, which simply says Conoco has a lease, these lands were set aside subject to valid rights, therefore its hands are tied. We got to clarify, first of all, the conclusion, its hands are tied. What does that mean? Well, basically the BLM is claiming, I can't do anything about Conoco. You know, my hands are tied. Don't hold me responsible, there's nothing I can do. Okay? They're offering an excuse. Next, premise 2. These lands were set aside subject to valid existing rights. Well, what does set aside mean? It means that you're not allowed to drill there. But subject to valid existing rights means that you are allowed to drill there if you've got a valid existing right. So this premise can be restated as saying that if Conoco does have a valid existing right to drill, then the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. Okay, what about breaking up premises? What about premise one? Well, that's one that I think we're going to have to break up, because it says that Conoco has a lease that gives it the right to drill. And gives it, we already marked as an argument marker, which suggests that the fact that Conoco has a lease is supposed to be a reason why it has a right to drill. So there's an argument implicit in that one sentence. And that means that we can take this whole argument and restate it something like this. Conoco has a lease, therefore Conoco has a valid right to drill. If Conoco has a valid right to drill, then the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, the BLM must allow Conoco to drill. That is supposed to be the central force of the explicit premises and conclusions in the first part, where the BLM gives its argument. The next part is Redford's response to this argument. Let's start with Redford's conclusion. What's he trying to show? He's trying to show the opposite of the BLM's argument. They're trying to show that their hands are tied, that is, that they can't stop Conoco from drilling. So Redford wants to show that they can stop Conoco from drilling, or even that they must stop Conoco from drilling. So that's the conclusion he's trying to reach. What he says is, sounds like Washington double-speak to me. Well, that's because he's saying that people in Washington always say their hands are tied and can't get anything done. And he's going to argue that their hands aren't tied because they can and must stop Conoco from drilling. So we can replace the conclusion simply with the claim that the BLM must stop Conoco from drilling. Now we know how the argument ends, so let's take those premises and conclusion and number them pretty high so that we can leave some room for the other premises that come before them. The next thing we need to do is to get an argument for that central premise: Conoco does not have any valid right to drill. Now, here's what Redford said: that the leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input, and in deciding to issue a permit now, the BLM didn't conduct a full analysis. Notice that there are two parts to these claims. One is about the leases, and the other is about the permit. Because in order to have a valid right to drill, Conoco needs to have a lease and a permit. Redford argues that there are problems with both the lease and the permit, but the considerations are a little different, so we need to separate those two parts into different arguments. The first part of his argument concerns the leases. He says that the leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input, therefore none of the leases conveyed a valid right to drill. Then the second part has to do with the permit. In deciding to issue a permit to drill now, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis, therefore none of the permits conveyed a valid right to drill. And the idea of the argument is going to be that the leases don't give them a right and the permits don't give them a right, so they ain't got no right. Wow. But that premise in the argument to show that the permit's not valid is a long premise with lots of different parts, so we need to break it up. And we can figure out how to break it up by looking at the argument markers in the part of the passage that in effect constitute that premise. We know that there's a premise marker at the beginning, once more, a discounting term, but, on the basis of is an argument marker, even is a discounting term, and that breaks that long premise into parts. So we can break them into A, the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands, no full analysis. B, the BLM determined that there would be no significant environmental harm. Okay. C, the BLM conducted only an abbreviated review of the environmental harm. And D, the BLM didn't even look at drilling on other federal leases. What about B? The BLM determined there'd be no significant environmental impact. Well, that's what Redford opposes, so that's not going to be part of his argument. How do the other three claims fit together? Which is a reason for which? Well, now we're into a different step, namely, organize the parts. And it's not completely clear, but it seems like Redford has two separate complaints. One is that the BLM did not look sufficiently hard at the environmental impact at this particular site, the Capirowitz Plateau. The other complaint is that they didn't do a comparative analysis and look at other leases on other federal lands to see, what happens when drilling was allowed there and when permits were issued in those other circumstances. So one claim is about this particular site, and the other claim is a lack of comparison to other sites. These 2 points become even clearer in the next paragraph, if you remember that. There he said, first, I've spent considerable time in these extraordinary lands for years, and I know that an oil rig in their midst would have a major impact. So there he's talking about the impact on this particular site, on these particular lands. But right after that he says, what's more, indicating it's a separate argument, what's more, Conoco wants to drill a well to find oil. Inevitably, more rigs, more roads, new pipelines, toxic waste, and bright lights would follow to get the oil out. There he seems to be suggesting if you just looked over at the other leases, you'd find that when you allow oil drilling, a lot more happens than you ever expected to begin with. I'm, of course, not agreeing with this. It might be true or it might not. My point is that this is the structure of Redford's own claims that make up his own argument. So there are two separate ways in which the review failed to be full. The first is that the BLM conducted only an abbreviated review in the sense that they didn't look carefully at this particular site itself. And the second is that the BLM didn't look at drilling at other places. Therefore, the conclusion is the BLM did not conduct a full analysis. That seems to be what Redford's saying in this particular sentence. Now let's bring it all together and clean it up a little bit in the process. 1, all of Conoco's leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. That's supposed to support 2, none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. Then 3, the BLM conducted an abbreviated review. They didn't look as carefully as they should have at the lands. 4, the BLM didn't look at drilling on lands under the other federal leases, the comparative claim. And those 2 are supposed to support 5. The BLM did not conduct a full analysis. And what that's supposed to show is that 6, its permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill. Therefore, 7, which is supposed to follow from 2 and 6, Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. 8, if Conoco does not have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Make sense? Seem fair? I hope so. I think it's a pretty good reconstruction of what Redford had in mind. However, as you probably noticed already, these arguments are not valid yet. So we need to go to the next stage and fill in the gaps with suppressed premises. Let's do that now. Let's start with the BLM's argument. Is the argument from 1 to 2 valid? Is it possible that Conoco has a lease, but it doesn't have a valid right to drill? Well, sure. And so that argument's not valid. What do we need to add to make it valid? Well, we can add a very simple suppressed premise. If Conoco does have a lease, then it has a valid right to drill. If you add that to that premise that they do have a lease, then it'll be a valid argument to the conclusion that they have a valid right to drill. Next, is the argument from 2 and 3 to 4 valid? Yes, because it's not possible that Conoco has a valid right to drill, and also, if they have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must allow them to drill, and it not be true that the BLM must allow them to drill. So, we can take this part of the argument, which is really the BLM's argument, but it's in Redford's passage, and reconstruct it like this. Conoco has a lease. If they have a lease, then they have a valid right to drill, so they have a valid right to drill. And if they have a valid right to drill, then the BLM has to allow them to drill, so the BLM has to allow them to drill. Now we're ready for Redford's own argument. His goal is to refute the premise that we had to add to the BLM argument in order to make that argument valid. And in the previous lecture, we saw that a lot of people suppress premises that are questionable. And Redford wants to show how questionable this one is. He's not going to let them get away with that old trick. Starting with 1 and 2, is the argument from 1 to 2 valid? No, because it's possible that the premise is true and the conclusion false. So what do we need to add to make it valid? Well, we need to add a suppressed premise. And that suppressed premise basically says no lease that is made without sufficient environmental study and public input is valid or conveys a valid right to drill. Then we have a valid argument from that premise plus 1 to the conclusion 2 that none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. Next comes the step from 3 and 4 to 5. Is that valid? No. 3 and 4 say that they conducted an abbreviated review and they didn't look at drilling on lands in other federal leases, but those might be true, and it's still not be true that they didn't conduct a full analysis. To explain how you get 5 out of 3 and 4, we have to add another suppressed premise. And that premise can simply say an analysis is not full if it's abbreviated and if it doesn't look at drilling on lands in other federal leases. Notice that I use the word and instead of or in the suppressed premise. And the reason is that I want to make Redford's argument look as good as possible. And his premise is going to be more defensible if he uses and instead of or. Because with and, the premise means that the review is not full if it has both of those problems. Whereas if you have or, it says that the review is not full if it has either one or the other of those problems. And some people might say, if it's only got one of those problems, it's still a full review. You know, it's a little problem, it's a little flaw. But if it's got both of those problems, then Redford's on stronger ground in saying together they show that that's not a full review. So if I want to make his premise look good, and that's part of the point, then I want to use and in the suppressed premise here instead of or. What about the step from 5 to 6? Is that valid? No, here we need a suppressed premise too. Which one? Well, we could just add that if the BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impact, then the permit does not give the permit holder a valid right to drill because the process by which they obtained the permit was not a proper process. Next, what about the move from 2 and 6 to 7? 2 says that Conoco doesn't have a lease that gives it a valid right to drill, and 6 says that Conoco doesn't have a permit that gives it a valid right to drill. Is it possible that both of those are true and yet the conclusion's false, and Conoco does have a valid right to drill? Well, yeah, if there were some other way for it to get a valid right to drill. So, to make that argument valid, we have to add another suppressed premise, which says, basically, if the lease and the permit don't give it a valid right to drill, it ain't got none. More formally, and more stilted, we can add a suppressed premise that says, if none of Conoco's leases gives it a valid right to drill, and Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill, then Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. And that should make that step of the argument valid. There's only one left, the step from 7 and 8 to 9. Is that valid? Yeah. It's not possible that Conoco doesn't have a valid right to drill, and if they don't have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow them to drill, and not be true that the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. So that's valid, and we don't have to add any suppressed premise to that one. And now we can take all these different explicit premises and conclusions and put them together with the suppressed premises that we just talked about, and we end up with this final reconstruction. 1. All of Conoco's leases were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input. 2. No leases that were originally issued without sufficient environmental study or public input give the leaseholder a valid right to drill. Therefore, none of Conoco's leases give it a valid right to drill. 4. The BLM conducted an abbreviated review. 5. The BLM didn't look at drilling on lands under other federal leases. 6. An analysis is not full if it's abbreviated, and it does not look at drilling on lands under other federal leases. Therefore, 7. The BLM did not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling on these incomparable lands. 8. If the BLM does not conduct a full analysis of the environmental impacts of drilling in these incomparable lands before issuing a permit, then that permit does not give the permit holder a valid right to drill. Therefore, 9, Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill. 10, if none of Conoco's leases gives it a valid right to drill, and Conoco's permit does not give Conoco a valid right to drill, then Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. Therefore, 11, Conoco does not have a valid right to drill. 12, if Conoco does not have a valid right to drill, then the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Therefore, 13, the BLM must not allow Conoco to drill. Of course, other reconstructions could be perfectly fine, even if they differ in a few details, because not every step in this process is purely mechanical. So it doesn't always yield exactly the same results every time. But I hope that this reconstruction seems plausible as a guess at what was going on in Redford's mind and the reasons that he had for thinking that the BLM should stop the drilling. If we want, we can check to make sure this structure makes sense by trying to diagram it. So here's a diagram that I made of the structure of the argument that I just reconstructed. To the left, you see 1 plus 2 and an underline under it saying that those premises work together in a joint structure, and an arrow to the conclusion from those two premises, namely 3. Then to the right of that, you see that 4, 5, and 6 are joined, 4 plus 5 plus 6, and an underline with an arrow to 7, because that's the conclusion that those three premises support. 7 plus 8 is then underlined to show they work jointly to lead to the conclusion 9, so there's an arrow to 9. And then there's a long underline between 3, 9, and 10, that other suppressed premise that was added. That shows that 3, 9, and 10 work together jointly and lead to the conclusion 11. And then 11 works together with 12, so you have 11 plus 12, and that's underlined with an arrow to 13. Now, the fact that we can draw this diagram confirms that the argument structure makes sense. Now, let's see whether you can do it yourself in the exercises.